Good morning, everyone. Yeah, it's kind of time to start our class. Our number is really down again today due to the combination of COVID and snowstorms things. So we're glad to have you here and continue on in our study of the book of James. Before we get into the study, let's pause for a moment and have a prayer together. Father, we're thankful to you for the day, the blessings that you've given. We're thankful for the fellowship that we share as your children. We ask your blessings on our assembly at this time, that we will worship you in spirit and truth, that we will learn from your word the things that will make us better and more faithful servants of yours. We ask that you would bless our teachers and bless our students in our studies. Bless this congregation in its efforts to serve you and spread your message in this area. Be with our leaders. Be with those who serve. Help us to be guided by your word and to be participating in the service that you would have us to be part of. Bless those of our number who are ill and those who are traveling, and continue to care for them. Bless our family members and friends that are also struggling with various things at this time of year, that they will derive comfort and strength from you. Go with us in all things and encourage us always. In Christ's name we ask it. Amen. So, if you're looking at your opening view foil there, last week I told you we were going to do part 3 on the tongues, and after studying it this week, I realized that the rest of James, from verses 13 through 18, isn't really addressing the tongue. The idea of maxims, or dividing it into maxims, is from a commentary on the book of James that I like really well, and they put that division in there. But what we're really talking about today is kinds of wisdom. And this will be a prelude to the topic that he's going to introduce us to us in James chapter 4, where things are going to get surprisingly more serious in a different kind of a way for us in our study. So that's what this is, why the change there. I hit that button again, didn't I? So by way of review, maxim number 1, trials will come, and these will bring endurance, which makes us mature and complete. Also part of maxim number 1, if you need wisdom, ask God for it. And I've highlighted that because that's really the topic that we're going to be talking about today. God gives generously and without reproach when we ask him for wisdom. Maxim number 2, be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Good advice in all walks of life. Receive the implanted word, which can save our souls, and that's important. There's a real connection there between receiving the word and having our souls be saved. And then this idea of be doers of the word and not just hearers only. It's not an intellectual exercise. The word is intended to stimulate us into types of service, into types of, in the way that we walk with God. We need to learn to bridle our tongues, which has been the topic of the last 2 Sundays. And we need to learn to show mercy. James talks about do not show favoritism, and especially do not show favoritism based on wealth or social standing, no matter how easy it is for us as human beings to do that. Mercy triumphs over judgment. We want to receive mercy. And if we want to receive mercy, then we need to show mercy to others. The 4th maxim, faith without works is dead. And while faith and works may be distinct, they are also complementary to each other. One is the evidence of the other. Abraham demonstrated and completed his faith by his works. When he left Haran with faith and a promise, and then at the end of his story in Genesis, he offered up Isaac as a sacrifice, even though Isaac was the son of promise through whom the blessings were going to come, knowing that he can't do that if he's dead, but he left it up to God to work it out. And so that perfected his faith in that. We also looked at the story of Rahab, a citizen of Jericho who had some spies because she saw that the God of Israel was more powerful than everybody else's gods, and she wanted to be part of that. Maxim number 5, be not many of you master teachers. Teaching is a function that's one of 5 that's designed to edify the church, to teach us how to walk in the various works of service that God has planned for us, and teachers can shape eternity. Depending upon how the teaching is used, it can do good or harm. Teachers also carry a larger burden and will be judged by how they handle it. Sins of the tongue are common and difficult to avoid. Talk is cheap, and sometimes we spend it like it's really cheap. When used correctly, our words can instruct, encourage, correct, build up, and be a blessing to others. When used incorrectly, our words can demean, degrade, incite, humiliate, ignite, or destroy others. And the choice that we make in the words that we use is an indication of our heart. That's who we are. Well, there's also a great danger in ignoring the fact that other human beings are also created in the image of God. And I mentioned this last week, and I want to emphasize it again. If we are going to harbor animosity for another human being, it's really, really helpful if we can degrade them from being in the image of God to being something less than that. Then it's not so painful, perhaps, for us to engage in it. But that's a dangerous thing to do. We are inconsistent in what we say because we are inconsistent in what we believe and how we serve and the values we should have. That's really ultimately what's going on. We're inconsistent with our words, we're inconsistent with our character, we're inconsistent with our behavior because we're inconsistent in our faith and our values. So, going back to James chapter 1, verses 5 through 8, I wanted to go over this as kind of a prelude to getting into the topic. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith without any doubting, for the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. So wisdom is an important topic in the Bible. It's a thing that we should be desiring to seek after, and God gives it. So that's what we need to do, is we need to ask. So I'd like to have a volunteer turn in our Bibles and read James chapter 3, verses 13 through 16, please. Gordon? All the way to 18. Okay, thank you for that. Here I put it up on the PowerPoint so that you can see what it is. And I've highlighted a whole lot of words in this, and we're going to go through them relatively fast as possible. But these are the words that it's going to be really important to understand if we're going to understand a passage. Wise, understanding, bitter jealousy. Gordon's translation said envy, bitter envy. That's, I think, a slightly better translation than the New American Standard, jealousy, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Selfish ambition. There's in verse 15, he says, this wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but it's earthly, natural, or sensual, is what Gordon's translation said. Demonic. We need to understand what those terms are and what they mean. And then verse 17, he's kind of giving us a fruits of the thing spirit. Like in Galatians chapter 5, we have the fruits of the Spirit, or the fruit of the Spirit is. Well, this is the fruit of the wisdom from above in verse 17. And so for that, we're going to need to understand those terms. And then the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace and by those who make peace. So that's his concluding thought on this particular passage. So, getting into the words. The Greek word in verse 13 that's translated wise is Sophia. We've encountered this word before. That's the same word that James uses when James 1:5, when he talks about if you need wisdom, ask God. Same word. Understanding, what the King James Version says, endued with knowledge, means to have knowledge or skill. Jealousy, in verse 14, which the New American Standard has, or envy, is from the Greek zelos. And this is the word from which we get words like zeal or zealous. Zealous basically describes a strong emotional reaction or desire, and by itself it is morally neutral, meaning it's not good or bad. You can have a zeal for a lot of different things. Sometimes it's a good zeal, maybe it's a passion that drives you to work or something like that. Sometimes it's a very negative thing, but it's always a strong thing. We'll get into that a little bit more in a minute here. The word that's, oh, I already said that. So James describes this zeal as bitter from the Greek pikros, which means to cut, to prick, pungent to the sense of taste or smell. The thing about bitter is once it gets in your nose or gets on your tongue, it's really hard to get rid of it. My daughter-in-law, Lee, had this thing that she likes to do with my wife where she'll taste something and say, wow, this tastes awful, or this tastes bitter. Here, come and taste it. My wife does not taste it. Why would you taste this thing when we already know it's not going to be a good thing here? Bitter is like that, and it also has a sense of persistence to it. And keep that in mind when you're reading this particular term. It's not something that just happens instantaneously or goes away instantaneously. The Greek word translated selfish ambition by the New American Standard is eros, and it basically means strife or contention, but at its root it means a desire to put oneself forward. Everybody knows somebody like that, and there's pretty good odds that everybody's already been somebody like that as well. So the idea of I want to be important, I'm going to put myself forward, that's what he's talking about. The Greek word translated arrogant is from a 5-syllable Greek word that means to boast against or to exult over. So this is basically blowing your own horn, usually to the detriment of others. So kind of gives you an idea here is where's a person's focus at? Self, right? Everybody has a legitimate self-interest. This is going way beyond that. Earthly is from a Greek word that indicates that it originated on earth or it's terrestrial. Natural or sensual is from a Greek word that means according to nature or operating on instinct. A way that we use this word in our culture is you can go to a museum of natural history. What are they talking about in that museum? Usually they're focused on different types of animals and how they lived, or different types of plants and habitats and things like that. How does nature work? Well, there's a wisdom that goes along with that kind of a thing. Demonic indicates originating from a demon or Satan, and this form of wisdom is evil, purely evil. And that's in distinction to earthly and natural. Earthly and natural are not inherently evil forms of wisdom. However, they do describe things that are not eternal. So, and I'll get into that in just a little bit more in a minute when we start to unpack this. But pure is from the Greek hagnos, which is related to the word hagios, commonly translated as holy, and it basically means free from defilement or not contaminated. There's no impurity involved in the thing. Peaceable is from a Greek word irene, that means harmonious relationships between human beings. This is the Greek word from which we get the female name Irene. So the important thing here, though, is the idea of this is a harmonious thing. Gentle is from a Greek word that means equitable, fair, or moderate. Reasonable is from a Greek word that means easy to be entreated. Its opposite in the English is implacable. So a person who is reasonable is somebody you can work with and discuss things with and kind of come to some sort of a mutually beneficial arrangement. The implacable person is somebody you cannot do any of that with. They're pretty much my way or the highway. You know, I'm going to win because I'm self-promoting perhaps, but this is one that says, yes, let's work together, let's figure this out, let's come to something that's fair and equitable. Unwavering, this is an interesting Greek word. It's from the Greek word adiakronos or adiakritos. And we encountered diakronos back in James chapter 1, verses 5 through 8 with this idea of doubting or wavering. And it means literally to judge through, and I've kind of paraphrased this, the idea of picky judging or taking something, and it's a whole, and picking it apart and just taking out the parts of it that you like and kind of pushing the other stuff aside. The A, when a word in the Greek starts with the letter A, that's kind of like the English un. So there's a thing that is necessary, and then there's a thing that is unnecessary or not necessary. So adiakronos basically means you're not picky judging or you're not judging through. So this thing he said earlier that you were doing is wrong. He's saying you're not the kind of person that does that. Hypocrisy is transliterated from the Greek word hypocrisis, and it means, and it's usually used to describe acting in a stage play. It means to play the part, or what we would call acting. So several years ago when we had VBS, we had a play that we did with it, and I played the part of the devil. And I was really good at it. It was almost like it was natural. Kids remembered that for years after that. I'm not the devil, but I hypocrited the devil. And it was actually the finest acting job of my entire life, by virtue of the fact that it's the only acting I've ever done in my entire life. But you're basically pretending or being something that you're not. So, who among you is wise and understanding, has knowledge or skill? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy, this piercing negative zeal, with a strong aftertaste, and selfish ambition, this idea that I have to promote myself to prominence in here, in your heart do not be arrogant, to boast over or exalt, and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder in every evil thing. But the wisdom from above is first pure, uncontaminated, then peaceable, harmonious, gentle, equitable, fair, reasonable, easily entreated, full of mercy, good fruits, unwavering, does not engage in picky judging or picking things apart, without hypocrisy or playing a role. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Questions or comments? James opens with the ideas of wisdom and understanding. And these are two words that often go together in Scripture. If you do a concordance search in the book of Proverbs on the word wisdom, you will nearly always counter things like wisdom and understanding, or wisdom and knowledge. And if you look at Proverbs chapter 2, verse 6, you get all three of them in one convenient package. For the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. Understanding is a knowledge of how things work, and often this comes from observing a pattern. Wisdom is built upon understanding and allows us to apply understanding in different ways. And so let me give you a simple example. If I have a ball in this hand and I let go of it, what's it going to do? It's going to fall. If I repeat that 16 times, it's going to fall 16 times. We kind of understand that. Sir Isaac Newton was kind of the first guy, at least recorded in history, that looked at that and says, why does it do that? It always falls. And he actually studied and did experiments and things like that to kind of come to an understanding. And if you have a high school or a college physics book, you will have Newton's laws of motions and things like that in there. And you can physically, you can calculate mathematically based on the weight of the thing that you're doing there, how fast it's going to fall, and all of these kinds of things. And you'll also discover something else. When it lands, it has kinetic energy. Now, that's understanding. We've measured it, we've understood it, we know the process, we can predict it and that kind of a thing. But wisdom is, it has kinetic energy. Kinetic energy can be used to do work. And so what if instead of dropping a ball from up here, I have a big pool of water and I let it flow downhill? Then I can put a water wheel in this thing and capture the water as it's flowing downhill and use that to grind wheat into flour. Get a little bit further along in there and I can put some blades on there and I can drive a generator and make electricity. So understanding, when I let go of it, it falls and it has kinetic energy. That's understanding. Wisdom is, I can do work with that. So wisdom nearly always starts with some form of understanding or some form of knowledge, but the insight to do something useful and productive or to take advantage of something like that, that's the wisdom part of this thing. And that's kind of how these go together. Yes, Ricky? He had the insight to be able to do this. You know, coming from an engineering background, I always imagine myself in heaven asking God engineering questions. You know, why the speed of light and all of this kind of stuff like that. Now, I fully realize that none of these questions are likely to be relevant, but from an engineering perspective, what would it be like to sit in the presence of the ultimate engineer and understand how, why things were done a particular way? I mean, that would be exciting to me. Yeah. Yeah. And guess what? I can't argue with that. Yeah. Yeah. You know, but why is the speed of light 186,000 miles per second? Why is it not 187 or 185,000? I don't know. It'd be an interesting question to have. But it's based upon a wisdom, an understanding of how these things fit together. And that's one of the reasons we go back to God to ask for it, because he's already got this skill mastered. So, our words and our behavior will reveal whether or not we possess wisdom and understanding. And in verse 14, our words and behavior will also reveal any bitter jealousy, and I like bitter envy better there, or selfish ambition. Strife is often the result of selfish ambition because somebody is not getting what they want. And so they are willing to increase the conflict to get it. And there are, you know, self-promotion also presents the idea, the impression that I am absolutely essential, or I'm the MVP of the entire world, or whatever, in order to get the goal that this individual has in mind from that. I've worked throughout my career with quite a few people that I characterize as the political animal. And the political animal always has a very good understanding of what's good for them, or what goal that they're trying to achieve. And there's often a wisdom that kind of comes along with this, with the ability to do this. If you're a political animal, you've honed your skills a little bit more to understand which presentations do I need to make because those are the most impressive, or they have the most impressive audience. How do I phrase things to kind of suggest that I was really the key to the whole thing without coming out and say I was the key to the whole thing? There's a certain wisdom that goes along to that kind of presentation. And we can learn and acquire that particular skill if we choose to do so. But James describes this behavior as a lie against the truth. Because usually when I'm self-promoting, you know, my own achievements and things like that, I'm ignoring everybody else's, or belittling everybody else's, or simply framing everybody else's as being of lesser importance than mine, and that's not necessarily true. And in most cases, it's not true at all. This wisdom that's produced, or is produced by a bitter jealousy and selfish ambition, does not come from God. God doesn't teach us how to be bitterly envious. God doesn't teach us how to have selfish ambition, even though we may have acquired the skills and the wisdom to do that. This kind of wisdom originates from the earth, our natural instincts, or from Satan. So, what's an earthly type of wisdom? How many of you have had a job? Yeah, everybody's had a job. When you start a job for the first time, you go in there, and the first thing you have to learn is the skills to do the job, right? And if your first job is frying hamburgers at McDonald's, there's a whole process that they go through there, how long you put it on, how often you flip it, how you assemble it the most effective manner. You got to learn all of these kind of steps, and you develop a skill that goes along with it. So in this congregation, I know some people that have had various different professions that I have consulted with on matters that are outside my expertise. I've had plumbing problems. Talk to John Hall. I've had electrical problems. Talk to Rodney Mayo. And I've had heating and air conditioning problems. Talk to the sergeant boys. This kind of a thing to gain, some insight into this particular thing. So, and this is all earthly wisdom. Is it bad? No. You have a job, you ought to learn some skills, you ought to have some wisdom in it. Does it translate to heaven? I don't know. Do we have plumbing in heaven? Is the electrical grid operational in heaven? Who's writing the software in heaven? That's my job. The eternity has existed this long without my help, so I kind of figured maybe none of that's necessary. But it's not bad, is it? It serves a function and a time, and this time in this particular place. Natural's a little bit more conflict-oriented, I think. If we all be animals for a second here and think like animals, in the animal kingdom, if you encounter another animal that's much bigger than you, it's a threat. Why? It's going to eat you. Might eat you. If you're a lot bigger than another animal, it's a meal. If we're the same size animal, the same type, things like that, we're competitors. I mean, I need a certain amount of territory to sustain myself, and you need a certain amount of territory to sustain yourself, and sometimes we'll fight over a piece of ground because it's good territory and we both want it. No consideration really, you need it, I need it, or can we share it or anything like that. You know, it's the same thing in the time of the mating cycle and things like that. Everybody's competing for a mate and this kind of a thing, and that's how animals work. There is a wisdom to that. Probably even less applicable to eternity than what we would call earthly wisdom. And then finally, there's this demonic wisdom, and that's clearly evil. I mean, look at the source. Where does it come from? What does it produce? That's clearly evil. And in verse 16, when a group of people are dominated by this kind of wisdom, a strong negative zeal and an inflated self-worth that wants to promote itself, conflict is inevitable and possibly brutal. Why? Because if I'm promoting myself, I want the attention, I want the rewards, I want the glory or whatever goes along with it. And if you're promoting yourself, you want the attention, the rewards, and the glory, and there's not enough to share. I want it all. You want it all. So how do we resolve it? It's not going to be a simple negotiation, is it? And then in verse 17, it describes the fruit of godly wisdom. It is a pure, harmonious, fair, easily entreated, full of mercy, produces good fruits, doesn't judge by picking everything apart, and it's not hypocritical. Now think about that wisdom. It is a wisdom, isn't it? It teaches us how to properly negotiate our way, working and walking with each other. It teaches me to respect you as creatures of God. It teaches you to respect me as creatures of God and created in the image of God. And it places a different value on that kind of an interaction there. You know, the idea of harmonious is also kind of a subtle thing, but we're not all doing the same thing, are we? Just like when we sing later on in worship service, we're not all singing the same part. But it works together, doesn't it? So there's that as well. And then righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So the focus here is on the doing of the peace thing, isn't it? What are we planting? How are we planting it? And then what does it produce? We're sowing peace. We're planting in peace, and yet what does it produce? Righteousness. Seems a little bit off in the sense where we're talking about peace, but it produces righteousness. And that's kind of the goal, isn't it? Sometimes you get a thing from a different way than you might normally think about going about it. But here, sow peace, in peace, get righteousness. Questions or comments? So in contrast to that, those who plant the seeds of bitter envy, self-promotion, and conflict will produce a different fruit. This is not something that's being sown in peace. It's not peace being sown in peace. It's usually contention, strife, a whole lot of drama and that kind of a thing. And it's going to produce some form of unrighteousness. It's kind of impossible to predict necessarily what that will be. If you look historically over some of the various cultures and things like that, Paul in Romans chapter 1 talks about how the Gentile nations descended into unrighteousness, and he describes several patterns of behavior that the Roman Empire, the Greeks, and some of these other people of that day and time had. And one of the things that's interesting about that discussion is if you go back and look in the Old Testament at some of the patterns of behavior of the Canaanites and the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians, and all this kind of thing, there's some similarity between the way they practiced unrighteousness and the Romans practiced unrighteousness, but there's a lot of differences. They customized their unrighteousness to suit their own intents, purposes, or options or opportunities, and the Romans did that, and the Americans are doing that, and the Europeans are doing that in our day and time, and in Asia, they're kind of doing this. They all have this one thing in common, though, is it's unrighteousness. It's not what God wanted of the human species on this planet. It's not what he wanted of us. So you're going to wind up someplace, you're not going to like the destination if you persist in it, but it might look a little bit different depending upon who you are and where you are. Questions or comments? Yes, Ricky. Yes, I could if I had time to research it. Yeah. That's kind of like a book of Romans sort of study on the topic being righteousness. James is kind of assuming that we understand it. I mean, it's a characteristic of God. And it's an important characteristic, a defining characteristic of God, along with several others. And it's a way that we are like him. So there's the idea of obviously being sinless. You know, sin and righteousness don't go together. But I think it's also a pattern of behavior. That's the way that we conduct ourselves. And so, you want to be righteous, then you got to be like God. I think Paul kind of gets into that more. He gets into that a lot more in the book of Romans. And James just is assuming here that we have a basic understanding of it. So, yes, Rodney? And that's kind of sometimes a difficult thing for us to get our minds around. We live in a very individualistic, merit-based society. And, this is a society that coins phrases like the one who dies with the most toys wins. Basically, you've accumulated enough wealth to be successful and have all of these, fabulous things, and that's the measure of your worth. And faith isn't that way at all. The faith is at its core, I know a guy. I know a guy who died for me and makes that possible. So, it's not uncommon for us to struggle with that. We're not the only society that does that as well. Any other questions, comments? Tim? Did you hear that, Ricky? Yeah, Tim's comment was the beginning of righteousness is the understanding that we've been set free from sin. And that's actually a really good definition. I mean, Paul talks about that in Galatians 5, for freedom Christ has set you free. And that was the definition of that word, which I originally hated the first time I heard it, is you're not in chains, you're not a slave, and you're not in debt. And the reason I hated it the first time I heard that definition is don't tell me what a thing is not. Tell me what it is. And yet freedom is precisely those things. And all of this space around it where we're not in chains and we're not a slave and we're not in debt, that's freedom. And that's the realm we're walking in. So that's a good point. That's the beginning. All right. Any other questions or comments? So, wisdom and understanding are important topics in Scripture and characteristics we need to possess as children of God. There is a wisdom from above that James talks about that we should be seeking and asking God to give us. When we're asking God for wisdom, this is what he's talking about. I think, personally, it's okay to ask for earthly wisdom or something like that when you're struggling with something to this life, because it turns out God is probably familiar with that as well. But the thing that's going to sustain us in eternity is the wisdom from above. If we possess this wisdom, our words and character will show it. If we are not seeking God, then we are investing in something else, and usually it's ourselves and our own interests. So we're going to be centered on something or someone. Now, everybody in here has a legitimate self-interest, There are certain things that you need to do on a daily basis to sustain your life. There are certain relationships that we need to have so that we can be emotionally healthy and feel secure in these kinds of things. These are all legitimate. But there's also a self-focus that goes far beyond that, and it really kind of comes down to the fundamental question, who's your God? Is it God or is it me? So which one of those are you going to promote? And the way that we behave tells us that. And we are going to struggle with it. Even when we've made the conscientious decision that we want to follow after God, these things just don't lay down and die overnight. It's going to take a little bit of work and effort, part of a transformation, but that's got to be the goal. All of this will be revealed in our character when we're pursuing ourselves, our own interests, as this idea of a bitter zeal and selfish ambition. It's a hard pill to swallow. Usually when we talk about somebody being bitter, we're talking about a pattern of behavior. This is something that we've observed over time. If I were to tell you, at 8:53 this morning, Andy became overwhelmed with bitter envy, that doesn't make any sense because there's no evidence that any of that has ever gone on. And so what happened at 8:53 that suddenly did this transformation? Well, it doesn't work that way. He may have had a moment at 8:53, probably not, but he may have had a little moment that stressed him or bothered him somewhat, but he didn't magically transform into this type of behavior. But as a course of action, choices can be made that take us down that path. And one of the things about being bitter behavior is when you see a person that's trapped in that, do they look happy? Do they look fulfilled? Are they enjoying life? Are they accomplishing their goals and things like that? And the answer is no, they are not. They are so stuck in this pattern of bitter envy, bitter zeal, that it's a really hard thing to break out of sometimes for some people. It requires some work. When we are controlled by our own self-interest, conflict is impossible to avoid. Simple fact, there's not enough resources to go around. There's not enough promotions at work to go around for everybody to get one. There's not enough, of any resource that we can all have it, so we're going to fight for it. There is a wisdom that is from God and another wisdom that originates in this life. The wisdom that originates in this life isn't necessarily evil, but it isn't applicable or useful in eternity. Wisdom from above is. However, one form of wisdom that originates in this life is evil, that which originates from Satan. we can learn wisdom and understanding that comes from God. I picked that little example of Isaac Newton not by accident. This was actually a seminal moment in the history of human science, the idea of why does it fall? What can I do to measure it, and this kind of a thing like that. A lot of the whole scientific method of how we do inquiry into natural phenomena comes about from that. That principle applies spiritually. There's wisdom and understanding that we can experience and grow in and come to understand better. Nobody in this auditorium has arrived yet. We all have the option to develop and grow and to acquire skill in this thing and to work together, be together while we're doing it. I mean, his description of the fruits of this is wisdom from above there. Did you see all of the phrases like harmonious, easily entreatable, and things like that? That's us being us. And this wisdom that comes from God produces these good fruits, and it benefits us and those around us. Which would you rather be? Operating with other people in harmony, peace, maybe having a little bit of stress or sometimes because we don't see things together, but working through it and coming to an equitable arrangement, things like that. Would you rather be wrapped up in bitter hate, bitter jealousy, self-promotion, and literally to where we're in mentally this dog-eat-dog world? Which is healthier for you? Kind of like going God's way on that. The other way is you can't win. There's always somebody who's better at that than you are or that I am. There's always more somebodies out there who can be better at this than I am or you are. So, God's way produces peace. It produces righteousness. It produces a much more positive outcome. And I'm just talking in this life. Now, you add in the scope of eternity, and there's no contest then. Questions or comments? Hit the wrong button. Okay, maybe I'm done. I think there's only one more point that I had left on there, and I think I already talked about it. So, two kinds of wisdom, two types of wisdom. There's from above and from below. From below is not necessarily bad. Any wisdom misapplied can be bad. But it's not necessarily bad. Some of it is, though, and it doesn't persist into eternity. And James is trying to get us to see what's the outcome when we go and ask God for this wisdom that we need. What's it going to look like when it arrives here? And it will be better for us physically, emotionally, and spiritually to act on that. Any questions or comments before we're done? Okay, then we'll get into James chapter 4.